Well, hello, everybody, and happy Pollinator Month. I am Joyce Kennedy. I'm with People and Pollinators Action Network, or PPAN for short. And we're so pleased to have you all here today. We're doing a series of educational webinars, so please keep your eyes out for more opportunities to connect with us via this platform. Also, please reach out during or after this presentation if you have questions about PPAN, or if you'd like to connect. We'll provide an email at the conclusion of the presentation for that purpose. PPAN was founded in 2014. We're an advocacy organization, and we're working across Colorado to educate and improve policies to better protect pollinators, people, biodiversity by increasing safe habitat, improving land management practices, and reducing pesticide use. We're building strong relationships and partnerships at the state and local level. And these connections are particularly important since we're working to address the many threats to pollinator health. And since the work we do is also unique here in Colorado and also regionally, the simple message is that we can all support pollinator health by planting flowers and not using pesticides on our properties, and ask others to do the same. We will be keeping the audience muted during the presentation, so please use the chat box if you'd like to introduce yourself. And if you'd like to ask questions, also please use the chat box and address them to the whole audience so that everybody can see your questions. We'll do our best to answer questions at the conclusion of the presentation with the time we have left, and still conclude at 1 o'clock. I will stay on Zoom following the conclusion if anyone would like to connect immediately afterward. We will be recording this presentation and posting it to YouTube soon. We are lucky to have Dr. Julie Morris with us, who will be presenting today. Julie is a PPAN board member and associate teaching professor in biological sciences at the University of Denver. Her training and research background is in the field of plant evolutionary biology, but she is currently most interested in biology education and outreach. Her current research focuses on strategies to improve engagement and learning effectiveness in introductory biology courses. And she's actively involved in sustainability initiatives on campus. Her favorite projects are helping to direct DU's community garden and 2 new student organizations, the Pollination Association and the Botanical Society. Please take it away, Julie.
Thanks so much, Joyce. It's great to be with all of you today. I wish we could do it in person. I enjoy seeing all of your smiley faces, but I am excited that at least we can have offer this opportunity under these strange conditions that we are all living in. So I hope we will learn something. Joyce mentioned that I am a plant biologist by training. So I'm going to talk about the life in our soils. But I will state up front that I'm not a soil biologist, that I have come to this interest, maybe as many as you. I'm an avid gardener and a plant biologist, and so and very interested in biodiversity, how we get all the different kinds of living things that we have on the planet and how those things interact. And a lot of what I'm going to tell you in this particular presentation, I have learned by sort of studying it out of my own interest. And hopefully you will be interested in some of it as well. So there's a lot in this particular presentation, and each section of it could probably have its own presentation. So this will definitely be, I would say, a survey And then if there's interest, I can always dive into some areas in more detail in maybe future presentations. So one of the important things to realize, I think, is that soils do a lot of things for us as humans. So you may have heard of the idea of ecosystem services, these things that things in nature provide for humans, and soil definitely is a huge area that provides these ecosystem services, from you know, providing the substrate for the food that we grow and the homes that we live in, supporting other kinds of life, being part of the cycles in nature. All of these things are incredibly important services that that soils provide. And one caveat of this, right, is that these amazing services really only come successfully from healthy soils. So I think kind of one of the misconceptions, right, is that it's just dirt. The rest of the life is in it, right? It supports things. But when we talk about soil, that's very different from what we would talk about as being dirt. So part of what I want to talk about today is what's the difference? What do we mean when we talk about soil? And what makes a healthy soil versus an unhealthy soil. And what we know basically is that really, in reality, right, these healthy soils are an ecosystem. And in science, we define an ecosystem, right, as an interaction between the living parts and the non-living parts in a particular area. And soil in itself is an entire ecosystem. It's not part of an ecosystem, it is an ecosystem. And healthy soils have sort of these main ingredients. So you've got your minerals, your air, your water, your organic matter, and the living organisms. And getting all these together in the right place are what make a healthy soil. So I'm going to go through each of these a little bit, keeping in mind that I'm a biologist. So we're going to do a little geology at the beginning, just to, so we're all on the same page, and then we'll get to the biology. So one thing that's important to understand about soils, right, is that they're different. If you've spent any time digging around in it, you realize that different areas have different types of soils. And you travel around in wider areas, you see more and more of that. So the traits of the soil come in part from what we call the parent materials. It's very sciencey terminology, from which those soils are made out of. And like all other matter in the universe, we have this certain set of elements that that make up everything, and soils are not an exception. And when we get to the mineral level, right, minerals are specifically solids, right? Combinations of these elements that end up in specific arrangements that make them solids. So if you talk about a mineral like quartz, for example, right, the recipe for that would be a little bit of silica and a little bit of oxygen in the right arrangement, and you get something like a quartz. Different kinds of minerals then have different recipes of these elements. So to get a particular kind of feldspar, for example, add a little potassium, a little aluminum to the silica and the oxygen, and you get a different kind of mineral. Okay, so, and then these base minerals are combined in different ways through all of the amazing processes on the planet. Think volcanic processes and shaping of mountains, all of these things, into the things that you might call rocks, the things that make up our amazing mountains. And then the process of getting soil, right, is there's some more steps. So a little bit more geology, earth sciences here. When you have the rocks, then over time, these rocks break down into smaller and smaller pieces through the processes of weathering and erosion. So Weathering takes the bigger pieces and breaks them into smaller pieces. Think often, for example, water getting into cracks and then freezing and breaking these down over time. And erosion is then the movement of those away from the parent materials by wind and water. So these make smaller and smaller pieces and transport them to other areas. And it's sort of this combination of processes. You've got your parent material and you've got your erosion and weathering. And this is from where we get sort of what we call soil texture. So you're probably familiar with this kind of thing. You might talk about a clay soil or a sandy soil. And these textures are defined by the size of the particles that make them up. So there's very specific standards of what you would call a sand versus a clay. And these are based sort of depending on the size, where something with a gravel is a larger particle, sands down to the very smallest particles that would be in a silt or a clay. And then the way that these end up arranged together, this texture determines other characteristics of soil. So when you describe a particular soil, you would talk about the soil texture, and then that's going to determine things like porosity or permeability. And this has to do with, right, how these individual particles sort of settle in together. And so different types of soil may have different types of porosity and permeability. Something like a shale or a limestone on the low end of porosity scale, and something like sand or gravel on the high end of this scale. And these characteristics are what then influence the amounts of air and water. So how much air can be trapped between the particles, and how quickly water that right, is added to the system from rain or snow, these kinds of things, how fast that water moves through are influenced by these other characteristics. So now we've got our minerals, our air, and our soil, and we're starting to get all of the pieces together. So we've got minerals, air, and water at this point, and different formation processes, historical types of things will end up with different types of soil. Now we get to more to the biology side of things. So adding these next two components, the organic matter and the living organisms. So organic matter, you've probably heard this, right? If you're a gardener, I'm sure you've heard that having organic matter in the soil is very useful when you're trying to grow things in that soil. A couple of things just to point out, when we use organic in this way, we're not using organic like we would say organic vegetables that you might buy at the grocery store, or organic farming techniques. What we're talking about when we talk about organic matter is from organic chemistry. Right? It's a particular brand of chemistry that that focuses on especially carbon. And life on our planet is carbon-based, one of the most important elements that make up especially living things. So there are different components of this organic matter, and you could do a whole nother lecture on sort of talking about the difference between humus and and other types of organic matter. But to oversimplify a little bit, part of the organic matter is there's life, right? There's life in it, and formally living. So organic matter was created by life, and it is either alive or was recently alive. So if we're talking about sort of freshly decomposed living things, that's a fraction of it, to living things that are, right, what we call decomposing matter. So as these things break down more and more into smaller and smaller pieces, it's still the remnants of living things. And then by the time we get to the stuff that's called, that we would sort of classify as humus, that's been broken down into smaller pieces, but it's still the remnants of living things. So all tied in with biology. And at some point, you probably have heard of nutrient cycling, and in official ecology terminology, we talk about that as the movement of these elements between the living and the non-living parts of an ecosystem. And this is true of soils, right? So this process of decomposition is taking all of the elements that were in the bodies of the living things and returning them into forms that can be then brought back in and used to construct new living things. The cycle of life. You have to have death and life because the pieces and parts that are needed to create a living thing come from breaking down formerly living things. And you can look at sort of a simple type of diagram, and then you can get into more and more details. So, right, decomposition kind of sounds like just something that happens, right? If something dies, then it decomposes. But decomposition is actually an incredibly complicated process, which you can spend a lifetime studying how exactly this happens, how larger organisms are broken into smaller and smaller pieces, and then how those pieces are returned back into the living components. So, and each element, like nitrogen or phosphorus or carbon, follows a different pathway through these cycles. And so there's a lot to study here for sure. I'm going to focus, right, if you notice, that in the center of this are sort of the organisms, right? So decomposition is not just a process that would happen without the living things that are in the soil. So this is where life comes in, because without the living organisms there, this decomposition step doesn't occur, and these nutrient cycles stop, which is problematic for the entire ecosystem, because the movement of these elements around and around in the ecosystem are critical to the health both below the soil and above the soil. So if we think about right, our planet, often it's broken into, when we're studying it, we talk about the atmosphere, which is the air that we breathe, or the hydrosphere, which is all the water, fresh water and salt water on the planet, or the lithosphere, right, which is the earth. And then we talk about the biosphere, which is life. Soil really is in the center of that, because it's one place where each of these spheres are overlapping and interchanging. So it really is, when you talk about what supports life on this planet, the soil is right there in the center of that. So focusing on what's in there, like what is in our soils. And everyone's probably familiar with right, earthworms. When you think about life in the soil and what people understand about the importance, for example, earthworms are, right, even small children would tell you that that's important for maintaining a healthy garden. If you want a healthy garden, you got to have those worms in there. And that is definitely part of what's in there. But I think, right, there's a lot more often that people are completely unaware of. And because we walk over it all the time, and because often it's not visible to the naked eye, it's not as well known. And really, earthworms are a tiny little part of the story. Still incredibly important, but earthworms alone are not going to balance an entire ecosystem. So just as with our ecosystems, think about a forest above ground. All of the life that is interacting there are sort of equally important in maintaining the stability of those ecosystems. So if you start taking out pieces and you decrease the simplicity of these systems, then they're not as stable. So That's one thing that we've learned from studying ecology is the more diversity you have, the more stability that you have, and also resilience. The idea that when you have some kind of disturbance, a more resilient system bounces back easier, more easily, and the less sort of diversity you have, the less resilience that you have. And soils, right, you might have studied at some point food webs or food chains. So this idea that all of the living things are interconnected in different ways. So who eats who through the food chain. And the bottom of the food chain are the things that we call producers. Those are the things that photosynthesize, that are able to take base nutrients and a little energy from the sun and turn it into chemicals that support the rest of life. And then, right, there are these different levels of consumers that take advantage of the producers and eat them, or eat something that ate them up through the food chain. And so these food chains occur in soil, not just above the soil. So there are right things, right, think about the plants that are growing in the soil, those are the producers, and then that's producing a lot of the organic matter that is the fuel for the soil food chains. But within the soil, there are things that eat plants, and there are things that eat each other. And so you can think about some things, little insects in the soil, for example, being the wolves of this particular ecosystem, and other things being the rabbits of the ecosystem. And all of these are important in maintaining the stability of the entire system. And again, because we walk over it every day and it's hidden beneath our feet, we don't realize how much is there. So these are estimates, but have been supported by a lot of studies and a lot of data that, for every square meter of soil that might support one of us larger organisms on the surface, there is a lot of life below the surface that is making that possible. So literally all of these millions and billions and trillions of organisms are required to support each one of us and each one of the other animals that live on the surface. And these are big numbers when you start to realize. And it's one square meter of soil is not very much. And then if you multiply that over the soil of our entire planet, you start to get a feel for how much is actually there under your feet. And some things are a little bit more visible. These organisms, right, that live in the soil and use the soil at home as a home. Think are the moles and prairie dogs in our area, and again, depending upon the soils that they live in for their home. There are also lots of other tiny things that you may have run into in the garden that we would call the macroinvertebrates. These are big enough to see with your naked eye. If you dig around a little bit, you probably have seen some spiders and some ants and some centipedes and millipedes. All of these guys are different kinds of animals that are right, living in or on or around in the soil, and are very important. And they're all serving sort of different purposes as well. A lot of these organisms change the texture of the soil, so they have things like they impact the porosity that we were talking about, and make more space for air and water. They bring more organic nutrients from the surface that are created by the leaf litter, sort of broken down into smaller pieces that then can be taken into the next levels of decomposition. And again, you might think about some of these things as being pests, for example, but really all of them are serving purposes and interacting in a way that is, again, supporting and maintaining the entire, the rest of the system. And if you have access to a little bit of magnification, right, the closer that you look, the more life that you find. And if you just sift through a little bit and look at it, you know, something with a magnifying glass or right, even higher amounts of magnification that we get from microscopes, you can really see just the crazy amount of life. And it's almost like a strange little alien creatures living in there that, again, you're just walking over every day without realizing that they're there. There's an incredible amount of diversity of these things. And they come from lots of different groups of animals. So you might think about insects, for example, but there are a lot of things other than little microscopic insects there. Things like mites, which are more closely related to spiders, weird little organisms called rotifers that you would need to see with a microscope. Might almost think that that's a little, you know, microscopic organism, but it's actually an animal with a complete gut and tiny, tiny little creatures. Springtails you may have seen, especially digging around in the soil, but you need a microscope to see them. And one of my personal favorites that you might find, these little creatures called tardigrades. If you've got a little extra time today and you're bored, you should just Google tardigrades and read about them because they're pretty incredible. There's also a lot of really fun videos of them moving around. They're often sort of their common name. They're often called water bears, or I've also heard them called moss piglets, which I love. Strange, again, little animals, microscopic animals that you would need to see only with powerful microscopes. And they've got 8 legs, so it's, again, not an insect, strange little claws on their feet, really weird face. And these organisms are incredibly hardy organisms, so it's almost impossible to kill them. They can, you find them all in every environment on Earth, and they can tolerate extreme temperatures down to like minus 300 degrees Fahrenheit, up above 300 degrees Fahrenheit. They've exposed them to radiation and boiling liquids and extreme pressures greater than you would find on the bottom of the ocean. And these little guys keep on ticking. They've even taken them to space and exposed them to the vacuum of space and all of the radiation, and they live for greater than 10 days. So they will be here long after we are gone. Incredible little organisms that you should read more about today if you have time. Another really important microinvertebrate that is especially important when you're talking about soils, because that's where a lot of them live, are little organisms that are called nematodes or roundworms. So our earthworms that we were talking about before, those are called segmented worms, a different group of animals than these little guys that we would call called roundworms commonly. And again, a lot of people don't know about them. If you've heard about them, right, some of them are parasitic and cause problems with humans, but they're incredibly diverse. So there's way more of them than our human parasites, for example. And a lot of them live in the soil. So in our square meter of soil that we were talking about before, you would find 5 million of them on average. And they are really, of the animals, if you just counted the number of individual organisms, they are most of the animals on the earth. And it's strange to think about that, again, because we don't see them, but they're in our plants, they're in our soils, they're on the bottom of our oceans, they're in our bodies, and incredibly important for soil ecosystems. A lot of them are parasitic, and so they can attack plants. They can be a pest from the perspective of trying to grow plants on the surface, but they can also, a lot of them are also critical. So they're not all bad guys, and most of them are doing very important things in the soil, and just huge, huge quantities of them. And we haven't even gotten to all the other microorganisms. So far, we're just talking about animals. But right, there's so much more diversity within this microscopic world when you start digging around in there. So expanding on that a little bit further, there is a lot more life there. And if you look again at sort of the numbers, so we've gotten this far down. What we're going to talk about over the next few minutes, if you look at the numbers of these things per square meter, it's a sort of impressive numbers. There's way more of them than there are of us, and all of them are necessary to support each of us on the surface. So to talk about bacteria, people have at least probably heard this this word before. And there's definitely a lot of them in the soil. So these are pictures, maybe in some microbiology class in your past, you got to grow up some bacteria on one of these petri dishes and see them, because right, these are tiny, tiny microscopic cells. They're cells that make up the individual bacteria are orders of magnitude smaller than the smallest cells in our bodies. And they are single-celled organisms. So by the time you see them growing on a plate like this, you're seeing a huge population of organisms. So each one of these little spots on a plate is actually an entire city of bacteria that have grown up over time. And there are many, many different kinds. And bacteriologists, people who study these organisms, you can see their differences. So when you've seen one bacteria, you have not seen them all. There's an incredible amount of diversity. And they have different characteristics. They eat different kinds of food. They make different kinds of waste products. They compete differently with each other. And you can study each of these separately. So you can't lump them all together and say, this is what bacteria do in the soil, because each of these individual types of bacteria are going to be doing something different. They all have different strengths and fill in different parts of the ecosystem. And they're really, again, an incredible amount of diversity and pretty beautiful when you can get them up and look at them sort of on their scale with a microscope. And now we have microscopes, right, that are powerful enough to even look inside of those cultures and see the individual cells. And even right at that level, if you they're very different. So they come in different shapes, right? Some of them are able to move and others are not. But each of these are incredibly different organisms. And you know, just by looking at them on the surface here, you can tell they're different. But then when you start to study their chemistry and how they interact with the environment, you see way more differences. A lot of things that would look exactly the same, sort of one of these little round bacteria, for example, you could find two round bacteria that are acting in two completely different ways. So you can't just judge a book by its cover here. You have to get right into it further and look, for example, at their chemistry. So now we have the technology to see what kind of chemistry they produce and how they're able to interact with the environment. And the other thing that we've been able to do over the last 20 years ago, right, or so, we have the ability to read the DNA. So, all right, DNA is the program inside of living things that give them their characteristics, right? It's the molecule where we carry our genes and our genetic information that determine all of the traits of the organism. And this is true of bacteria also. And with our new abilities to actually get in and read this molecule, we're now able to compare living things that we couldn't even see before, that we didn't know existed. And because all of life has certain characteristics, those genes that are needed to make our individual cells, we share those genes with bacteria. So it's weird to think about the fact that around 50% of our genes are very similar to the genes of an E. coli bacteria. Even though on the surface we appear very different, when you read the genes, sort of the basic information that's required to be alive is very similar between a bacteria and a human. And by being able to read it, then we can sort of make comparisons between all the living things and start to learn a little bit more what is out there. And this has brought about sort of really exciting, it's like exploring a new planet all over again, because what we didn't realize is that we thought if bacteria didn't grow on one of those plates that it didn't exist. And that's not the case. In fact, we are not smart enough to grow a lot of things on the plates, but we can see them by reading their genes, even though we couldn't grow it on a plate. So what we discovered is that we hugely underestimated the diversity of life basically everywhere. So that includes on our soils, but also on our own bodies. So you might have read something or heard something recently about your microbiomes, our microbiomes, all the living things that are living on our body and all the important things that they're doing for us. But that's true of the soils as well. So what we realized by sort of being able to look at all of these things, we found, for example, entire branches of life that we didn't even know existed. And we'd seen them, we just thought they were bacteria until we were able to read their genes. There's this whole branch on the tree of life called the archaea that we were sort of mistaken them for bacteria because they are small cells similar to bacteria in shape. But when you look at their chemistry, when you read their DNA, they are definitely not bacteria. In fact, they have much more in common with the other organisms like ourselves. So, and if you kind of look at this whole tree of life, you can see that our closest relatives in this case are the fungi. So if you understand sort of the difference between us and a fungus, and you realize that it's closely related on this tree of life, it gives you a little perspective of how much diversity that we're really talking about. And the cool thing about this technology is that then we can start to compare different areas and start to see what kinds of living things are there. Even though we can't see them, we can infer their presence by finding their DNA and start to compare different kinds of ecosystems and different kinds of environment and get a feel for what's living there. And what we find is everywhere we look is different. So we're still really in the exploratory stages of this. We've just realized that it's there. We don't know very much necessarily about what it's all doing there. And that doesn't mean it's not doing things. It just means that there's a lot that we still don't understand, which is exciting in science. So these sort of studies of microbiomes, both from a human health perspective and an environmental health perspective, have really exploded over the last few years. And you can surf through the scientific literature, and we learn new things literally every day about what these organisms are doing there, and what their presence or absence, what the consequences of that are to the rest of living things. So that's all been really exciting. And again, we're just still in the exploratory stages. It's like we found a new planet and we're just classifying life. We still have a long time to go to figure out what all is there. There's a whole nother group of organisms called protozoans, different from bacteria. So if you sort of look on the tree of life that we were looking at before, and you look over at animals and plants and fungi on that branch, the rest of those things in brown are what we call the protozoans. And these are incredibly diverse. I would need a whole nother talk to to discuss all of their diversity, but they're fairly amazing creatures, and they are filling again all of the different roles. So much interesting diversity, and again, we don't even know what's there, much less what is it doing. Another one that you may be more familiar with are the fungi, right? And these are things that you would call a mushroom or a mold, and again, incredibly diverse organisms. Sort of in the past, these things were classified as plants, right? Some people would still mistake them as a plant, but they are definitely not a plant. They are very different. So, right, plants are able to make their own food through photosynthesis. Fungi cannot do that. So that's they're consumers just like animals. And also when you study their genes and you study their chemistry and you put them on a tree of life, you can see that, like I said before, they are much more closely related to animals than they are plants. Really strange organisms, much different than plants and animals in that their bodies are actually made of tiny little threads that we call hyphae. And these little filaments are just one cell thick, and even sort of the solid parts of an organism, something that you would call a morel or a mushroom, that sort of strange texture that it has is just because it's these tightly packed hyphae. And a mushroom or a morel is just the reproductive structure. The rest of the fungus is living in the substrate where the little morel pops up. And they're consumers like animals, but unlike animals, they don't really have a body. They don't have a mouth. They don't have a digestive system. They carry out what's called extra-cellular digestion. So they secrete all of their enzymes outside of their body, break down their food, and then just take in the particular elements that they need. It's a much different strategy, right? And instead of having to run around, right, they don't run around and catch their food like an animal, they just live inside their food. So there is no need to run around like animals, but it doesn't mean that they are not a consumer. So pretty interesting organisms that we could, again, spend an entire lecture on. So that's like a very quick survey, right, of just some of the major groups, the biggest groups of living organisms that you might find in the soil, and a peek into the huge numbers of them, and a little bit of an idea of how they interact. So as we study them more and more, what I want to sort of finish up on is what all of this life is doing in there. And we talked about it a little bit in the beginning, but I want to just highlight a few, again, bring these ideas back and summarize them here. That what's all of this life doing there? One thing they're doing is sort of modifying the soil structure and the water distribution. So remember things like porosity and permeability, and also sort of moving the organic matter into deeper and deeper levels. So they're building the topsoil through these processes, right? And this idea of decomposition, remember that doesn't happen without all the decomposers. We need all of those microinvertebrates and microorganisms that are taking all of these dead living things and breaking them down into smaller and smaller pieces. If there weren't decomposers, all the dead things would just pile up. That nutrient cycling doesn't happen on its own. It's a process of life. And this is really required, again, to keep those nutrients cycling through the rest of the ecosystem. And then there are some things about, right, specific to the plants and how they function. And I don't have a lot of time to talk about these things today, so I'll just briefly summarize, but often, right, we know that plants get nutrients from the soil, but they can't actually often do it on their own. And that's things that we haven't really understood. So one of those sort of interesting things is through a process called that plants do, they make these structures called root nodules. And they basically make a little home for sometimes some type of bacteria, and they attract the bacteria there by feeding it sugars that they make through the process of photosynthesis. And they're specifically attracting certain kinds of bacteria. So you may have heard that some plants are what are called nitrogen fixers. So especially like the bean family, your peas and soybeans and alfalfa. Often these plants are credited as being nitrogen fixers, but in truth, they can't fix nitrogen. So most of the nitrogen, which is an incredibly important thing, is actually in the air. And we can't get nitrogen, the nitrogen that we need to be alive, from the air. There's only certain kinds of bacteria that can take the nitrogen in the air and turn it into forms that can be used for the rest of the life. So bacteria, several different types of bacteria have this ability. And the plants basically take advantage of this by attracting them to their roots. And then they are able to get nitrogen because of the bacteria that live with them. Another really interesting thing that we're learning more and more about is what's called mycorrhizae. And this is a symbiosis or mutualistic relationship between a fungus and a plant. And they're way more prevalent than we understood in the past. And because fungi are master absorbers, but remember, they can't make their own food. So these organisms basically share. And the fungi have access to way more nutrients and water, and they can share with the plant. And so often these fungi grow around the roots of the plants, or sometimes even into the root structure itself. And then go about their life, breaking down things in the soil, and then they share with the plant. And the plant's superpower is being able to photosynthesize and make sugars, which the fungus can't do. And the fungus superpower is absorbing, and they are able to share. And as we realize that they exist, we understand that they're doing really important things in the ecosystem. So these two little pine trees, for example, are the same age and genetically identical, but one has been growing with its fungal friend, and the other one has not. And so when you look at a forest and you think about like why no one has to fertilize that, right? But we have to dump tons and tons of fertilizer on our cornfields. Part of that is because we have damaged the soil and the soil environments. So again, often we credit the plants from bringing nitrogen or phosphorus into the ecosystem, but it turns out that a lot of this couldn't be done without the fungi and the bacteria that live there. So kind of to summarize everything, it's not just dirt. Soil is a living organism and provides a lot of critical things. And the more that we understand about it, the more we realize that what we don't know and how much we've taken for granted, and how some of our actions have actually caused a reduction in soil health, which then have consequences in these other areas. So take home message, right, is remember that soil is alive, and if we treat it as such, then it will do all of those amazing services for us. So this is a little bit of an oversimplification, and we could do a whole nother presentation on this at some point. But if we want to maintain healthy soil, so if we want to talk about what makes a healthy soil, what makes a healthy soil, and what that we do that decreases the health of the soil, one of those things is to minimize disturbance. So in the past, right, we've done a lot of tilling and digging and all those kinds of things in our gardening and our agriculture. And it turns out that might not be a good thing because that kind of thing really disturbs the structure of the soil. and these complicated food webs that live in there. It's like, turning the entire city upside down every time, you want to plant new things. And that has an impact on the life that's lived there. So you're seeing more and more sort of conversations about minimizing tilling and minimizing the amount that we're digging. Because if you think about it, nobody's doing that in the forest, and the forest is just fine. So what is the forest doing that we could learn from? And one of those is minimizing the disturbance. Other types of disturbance besides tilling are all of the chemistry we use. So all of these artificial fertilizers and different kinds of pesticides. So think about insecticides and herbicides and fungicides. The problem with dumping all of these on our systems is that, think about all the life in the soil, right? The pesticide is a poison. These are poisons. And we're not thinking, we're maybe trying to get rid of the insect that's eating our plant, but we forget about all of the insects that are supporting our plant. And we definitely talk about this with respect to our pollinators, but really, right, this sort of interested in soil health and interested in pollinator health, these are really, we can attack them using these same ideas. And another huge thing is increasing plant diversity. So one thing that we do when we farm are create these huge monocultures, just giant fields of just corn, right? Or think about our yards, which are just grass. The problem with that is that this, again, remember, is the base of the food chain. And if you don't have any diversity in the base of the food chain, then you don't support diversity at other places. So with that, I will turn it back to Joyce, and hopefully we have time for a few questions.
Well, thank you so much for a fascinating presentation, Julie. You clearly could go on for another couple hours, and I think we would have wanted you to. So there may be a follow-up in your future.
It's all interesting. Yeah, you never have to twist my arm to talk about biology, so.
And so we do have quite a few questions, and we'll try to get to some of them. And I'll also see if Julie might be able to stay a little bit beyond one.
I definitely can. Yeah, I have no big pressing, so I'm happy to stay around.
Okay, so we'll officially close at 1, but we'll do what we can while we still have the majority of the people here. I just wanted to say that if you did enjoy this webinar, we'd love you to consider making a donation to PPAN so that we can continue to protect people, pollinators, and the planet. And you can do that on our peopleandpollinators.org website. And we will be distributing a short survey following the presentation, also a link to the recording. So if you can just take 2 minutes to fill out that survey, we can keep bringing interesting information to you. And if you did sign up for this webinar, you are now on our email list, and that's chock full of monthly news about pollinators, biodiversity, and healthy environments. So, and more events that we'll be having. So yes. we'll jump over to some questions. And Julie, were you going to say something?
Well, I was just going to say that we would take requests for webinars as well.
Yes.
So yeah,
that is in the survey.
If there are things you're interested in, let us know, and we will find interesting people who are experts to share their knowledge with us.
And I'll also say that if we don't get to all of these, feel free to follow up with an email to us. So there were a couple questions about just generally herbicides and pollutants and so on, and you touched on this, but how much damage do things like glyphosate do? Somebody even asked about like fracking wastes. Somebody also asked about natural insecticides like boiled rhubarb. So maybe you could just touch on that a little more.
Yeah, so right, clearly any chemistry that we're adding to the system affects the entire system. And when we're specifically adding chemicals that are meant to end life, So, right, think our pesticides, insecticides like the glyphosate and herbicides and fungicides, all of these are designed to end life. And you know, often when we talk about things like toxicities and those kinds of things to humans, we have studied that over sort of short periods of time and sort of high concentrations. And the problem is that these things accumulate also in nature. They don't break down over time. And so as we add more and more of them over time, they accumulate and the impact of them becomes greater and greater. And you know, there isn't really a difference biologically between the insects on the surface, right, or a weed in our plants. How those chemicals are sort of ending the life of those organisms are also going to have the same effect on the life. And think about sort of all the bacteria and those kinds of things that are living in there. We know when we take antibiotics, for example, it doesn't just kill the bad bacteria that live on our body, it kills the good bacteria. And we're learning more and more that there are consequences, negative consequences to that, that we are now facing. And so that is also true of our soils. As we add these things, we really need to think about the impacts, not just to the one organism or the one weed that we're trying to fight, but really all of the other life that's there, and understand that we may be fixing this one problem in one area, but we are creating so many other problems for ourselves. In addition to our own health, right? We are also a living thing, and evidence is accumulating rapidly that we've misused and overused this chemistry.
And referring to human health, is there actually a benefit to humans to have skin exposure to soil, kind of like what probiotics do to improve gut health?
Yeah, so evidence is increasing, right? So again, we've just barely realized that all of this life is on us and with us all the time, right? There are more of their cells on your body than your own cells, which is weird to think about. Roughly like 20 pounds of you is actually them. But the thing is, right, again, all of this chemistry is on our food, which then, you know, not all just impacting our chemistry, but also the chemistry of the organisms that we live with. And that has an impact. The other thing, so what they're often doing with these microbiome studies now is they're comparing, right? So evidence suggests that having a greater diversity of life with you is helpful to our health. Digestive health, immune health, even mental health has been connected to the diversity of the microbiome. And so then they started to look at how do you increase the diversity of your microbiome? And they found a lot of things. So people who grew up in the country playing in the dirt or had a garden have a greater diversity of microbiome than people who grew up in a very sterile sort of city environment. People who grew up with pets have a greater diversity. And so again, there's a problem with being too clean. And yes, gardening will increase the diversity of your microbiome.
Right. And you also touched on tilling in the soil, but there were a number of questions about just the disruption that there is in that network, and how long does it impact, and how do we get around that?
Yeah, the problem is that we're learning that's, you know, at a certain point, you can disturb the whole system so much that it doesn't bounce back. And so that's the problem with some of our agriculture fields and these kinds of things. So we lose the ability of those soils to bring nutrients to the plant. And so then we have to add all of this artificial fertilizer, which increases the problem, right? It's difficult to get the right kind of balance in the soil. And then the excess fertilizer runs off into our aquatic ecosystems, the water, and causes problems there too. So these side effects. And what we're learning is more and more as people sort of study alternatives, you see sort of movement to low-till or no-till systems or no-dig gardens, right? So if you Google that stuff, you will find lots of information about sort of new strategies that kind of move away from our traditional way of thinking, right? That we have to till in all of this stuff that we put on the surface. Instead, it turns out you don't really have to, just put it on the surface and it will break down, right? And hold the structure of all the life. So the less disturbance, right, allows this complex ecosystem to build itself. And so more and more research is going into how do we scale that up to the level of, you know, for example, our agriculture systems that would allow us to produce enough food to feed all of us. And so there's definitely movement in that direction. We would like to see more research and more movement in that direction.
And since it is 101, I'm just going to officially close out the webinar, and we will hang around for a little longer if people want to ask some more questions. But thank you so much for coming. We hope to see you again soon, and you all stay safe, and appreciate your time today. But we'll go back to questions.
Sure. I'll stay as long as people want to stay.
Yeah, yeah. And we still have 61 people on the webinar. So we'll keep going for a little bit. I think since we're on the tilling question, there are questions about how do we deal with the weeds. And I think that kind of speaks to the research going on of how to scale that up, because obviously there are some difficult weeds out there like thistle and, yes. You know, in people's gardens, it's easier, of course, because we can pull them, but large scale, it's trickier for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I fight with the thistle and the bindweed in my own small scale garden for sure. And part of the, you know, a lot of research also suggests that those kinds of those organisms, those things that we call weeds, actually are much more successful in disturbed soil. So we've created this problem that, you know, when you bring the soil health plant back and when you bring the biodiversity back, then these things don't have the same competitive advantage that they have in our disturbed systems. And so a lot of evidence is suggesting as you do things like cover cropping and multi-cropping, that the problem with weeds actually goes down over time. And you know, a lot of the problem is that our systems, right? Think about our technology, our tractors, all of these things are set up to deal with these large monocultures. So what we need to do to make progress is think about what kind of technology can we design that will allow us to do these sort of no-till and multi-cropping kinds of things on a larger scale. And we're practicing them in our gardens, and we're and definitely on the leading edge of agricultural research, you will see people doing this kind of work. But in order to scale it up to the next level where it really would be productive enough to feed all of us and the other couple billion people that are going to be with us in the next few decades, is that we're going to need new technology and support for that technology.
I'm going to jump to this one because it's so relevant, us being a pollinator organization. Can you make a connection between healthy soils and healthy pollinators?
Yeah, I would make it in sort of two ways, you know, because I think there are two things that I would say are the sort of would have the biggest impact in both of these realms, and that is the way we use our chemistry, right? So think about the pesticides that we've talked about, and then also the diversity, the sort of plant diversity. And both of those things are going to make a huge impact on the soil health and pollinator health simultaneously. So if, for example, we look on the slide of this Colorado pollinator habitat and you look in the background behind that sign, what you don't see is a lawn, right? So, and that's actually going to increase soil health and pollinator health both. So curbing our use of artificial chemistry and sort of increasing natural understanding the ecosystem and taking advantage of that knowledge, right? Sort of modeling natural ecosystems. Nobody has to take care of these things in the forest does it for itself. So if we can learn from the forest and model that in our gardens or our agricultural systems, then the system takes care of it for it, right? It does these things. So I would say those are the two most important things: greater plant diversity and less chemistry.
Great, thank you. Now, this is somebody that's working on their dissertation. Could you explain the relationship between plant microbiome, so such as in the food we eat, the soil microbiome, and the gut microbiome?
Yeah, there's, to be honest, not very much well known about this. So yes, people are spending dissertations right now studying all of these things, but some of the big patterns, you know, that they're seeing is that again, things like antibiotics and pesticides are impacting the biomes in each one of these places and reducing the diversity. And remember at the beginning, we talked about how reducing the diversity makes the whole system less stable and less resilient. And so then things crash, right? And then this sort of lack of diversity includes the microbial diversity. So we didn't really know that we were erasing it because we didn't even know it was there. So now that we know it's there, we realize that we're erasing it. And a lot of the sort of environmental issues that we're seeing and issues with human health are both now being highly correlated. We're still working on the cause and effect, but they're definitely highly correlated with less diverse microbiomes. So evidence suggests diversity good, and any way that we can promote that in any of those realms, whether it be our microbiome, the soil microbiome, the plant microbiomes, tends to increase stability and resilience.
Great. And one of the ways that we reduce turf is by smothering a yard. And so somebody's wondering if they're making the soil anoxic by doing that and how that kind of impacts the decomposition.
Yeah, it turns out smothering is actually not necessarily a bad thing because it actually, it kills the plants, but you still leave all of that organic matter there. So all of the roots and the dead plants that are the result of that smothering are still there. And then as long as, so you build on top of that, that's what you've just done is add that organic material to the soil that you're rehabilitating. And it doesn't necessarily make it anoxic, right? It actually takes decomposition in some cases, takes a little bit of anoxic. So different amounts of oxygen are required at different levels in sort of the soil. But, you know, depending upon then how you build on top of what you smothered, that is now going to become part of the organic matter and the structure underneath. So that's not a bad thing. That's
Great.
how I get rid of my lawn, exactly.
This is kind of interesting. If somebody wants to mix a mycorrhizal fungi inoculant product into the fill dirt in their yard, is that going to increase the nutrient and the life in the soil?
So potentially, the problems, right, is that is not just adding the organisms, but you have to support those organisms. So it would kind of be like, you know, reintroducing wolves to Yellowstone without having the rest of the ecosystem to support the wolves. The wolves will be there for a little while and then they'll just die, right? Because the rest of the system isn't there to support them. It's the same with these mycorrhizal inoculants that you can buy at a garden center, these kinds of things. The idea that their heart's in the right place, that you want to add these organisms back, but often that's not the natural, you know, environment for those organisms, and so they don't live very long. And so you have to think about feeding them and supporting them while you're adding them over time. And there's more and more sort of talk about how to do that, and how, for example, if you look in sort of natural composting or a natural farming, if you Google those things, you'll find sort of people who are working at taking the sort of natural stuff that's there, sort of the local stuff, and growing it up and supporting it right over time instead of trying to bring in something foreign. And that seems to work better, because then you're supporting the environment that they need to live and adding the organisms as well.
Right. There's some talk about using vinegar and how detrimental that might be to the soil life versus glyphosate, which does, it looks like it's just killing the plant.
Yeah.
So they're both damaging, but what are the relative?
Well, that's the problem, right? Because looks can be deceiving. So yes, right, the glyphosate is very fast at killing the plant. But that plant also then, right, the plant is moving nutrients down into the soil, right? And think about what it's sharing with the organisms around the root, right? Normally it's sharing the sugars that it makes with photosynthesis to share with these organisms, but they're also going to share the poisons that you put on the plant. These then leach into the soil and impact the organisms there. So, just because you only see the plant die doesn't mean that it's not killing the other things. And in truth, right, even something like vinegar is not a pesticide, right? It's just an acid. So there's a little bit of difference there. What it's doing is changing the pH of the soil. I didn't talk too much about that because that gets into the chemistry realm. we can find a chemist to help us with this, but what I will tell you is that the pH of the soil, how acidic or basic it is, determines how some of these nutrients move, right? Their ability to move. They're not going to move in the same way if something is more acidic. And so often what you're doing when you put on something like vinegar is changing the pH. And yes, right, that may make it hard for the plant to live there. But if it's hard for the plant to live there, it's also hard for the rest of the life to live there. And so I do use vinegar in spots in my garden where I'm specifically trying to rehabilitate and get rid of some of those really difficult weeds. But I realize that that too is changing the pH, and that's going to be something that I'm going to have to deal with after I add the vinegar. So it's a process. You have to realize that and even a natural pesticide. So I didn't address it before, but somebody mentioned the rhubarb, right? If something's a poison, it's still a poison. So there's not a huge difference between a natural pesticide and an artificial pesticide in the impact that they're having. You have to realize that it's not just the one target organism, that it's also going to have an impact on the organisms around it, and then balance that cost-benefit ratio with using those things.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you bring up pH, and I missed over this question. Somebody said that Denver is changing their water pH. I'm not aware of this.
Yeah, I don't know anything about that either, but pH, that does make a difference, right? So if you are watering your garden, for example, I don't know how much the pH is changing and all of those things, but one of a good place to start when you are trying to rehabilitate a space is knowing what the pH of your soil is. And if you send in a soil sample, for example, to like the Colorado State Extension Service has a really nice service, you send them some soil, they'll send you back a nice report of what nutrients are in there and what is the pH, all of those kinds of things. And then you could do things like do little experiments to see if I'm watering with house water, when those kinds of things changes, how does that impact the movement of nutrients in the soil?
Right, because it would certainly be, you'd need a whole house filter if you wanted to truly.
Well, yes, and depending upon the pH, right? So changing the pH is not necessarily a bad thing, right? So, and if it's a pH that supports humans, You know, so if it's something you would want to drink, it's probably okay still for your soil, but it might impact a little bit about, you know, what kind of nutrients you would want to add back into the soil, and, you know, how often you would have to add particular kinds of nutrients. Sometimes that might be impacted by the pH.
Well, there's clearly a lot of interest in how to deal with certain weeds like bindweed, how to deal with certain pests like Japanese beetle. And I will say, we are going to do an alternatives to pesticides webinar sometime within the next several months. So we'll try to dig into some of those topics in more depth.
Yeah, and again, I'm not an expert, but I am a gardener with a yard with where I fight with these things. So I can tell you some things that I try to do, but I think a couple of big things is, one is patience. There is no quick fix. There is no thing you can spray from a spray bottle and have it easily done and then not cause surrounding problems. There just isn't. And two, right, sort of altering perspectives on really what is healthy, you know. So a little bit of weeds actually is not hurting the garden. And so, you know, right, and sometimes, you know, the insects, you see aphids, for example, and you want to get them off of your plants as soon as possible. But if you wait just a little bit, the natural predators will come in and take care of those aphids for you. And you might have a little bit of plant loss, and it may be a little ugly for a while. But if you just sort of change your perspective on, right, what a beautiful garden to me now is diversity. The more sort of different kinds of insects and plants that I see growing there, the more healthy I think it is. And so then you can kind of sculpt, right? So what I'm doing some with the bindweed and the thistle in my own yard is just attacking it one plant at a time, and trying, again, to disturb the roots as little as possible, because if you've ever fought with bindweed, for example, the more you dig, you just make 9 more bindweeds. But if you snip it off right at the ground, leave the roots in there, which sounds counterproductive, and then just smother that, right? The weeds will, the roots will starve without the leaves. So if you're just patient and you keep removing the stuff on the top of the soil over and over again, eventually those roots will starve, they'll die, and they'll become part of the organic matter that's in your soil. So, you know, full-scale rehabilitation takes some time and some patience, but it's worth it in the end, so.
Wonderful. I think we will leave the questions at that point. And thank you again, Julie, so much.
Yes, I love to talk about biology. It is my job, but it is also my passion. So anytime.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining, and we hope to see you next time. And please fill out the survey that I will send out shortly.
Enjoy the summer. Happy gardening.
Yep. Take care all. You should check out the chat box.